This session describes the innovator's brain. What is happening inside of an entrepreneur's mind? What are the cells and synapses actually doing when an entrepreneur contemplates a new business opportunity? My name is Ted Ladd, and I'm a professor at the Halta International Business School, and we have undergraduate and graduate business programs in San Francisco, New York, Boston, London, Shanghai, and Dubai. And this session is an interview with Jeff Hawkins. There are two key pieces of his history which make him a spectacular expert. First, Jeff invented the Palm Pilot, which was the first handheld computer to go to the mass market, and it became the company Palm. He also then added a wireless data connection to the handheld computer, which was the progenitor for the mobile web, which is now how most of us experience the internet. And finally, when he went to Handspring, he created the Trio, which added a phone to a handheld computer. He created the first smartphone, which now impacts everybody on the planet for how we do business, how we interact with each other, even how we think. He then, second chapter for Jeff, he then wanted to follow his primary love, which was brain research, to postulate and then collect evidence on how the brain actually works. What are the cells and synapses doing in your brain when you contemplate and understand reality? In this video, I have asked him to relate his theory of 1,000 brains, which he popularized in a book recently, to some of his own entrepreneurial activities. This is not a book review of 1,000 brains. It's more an extension of 1,000 brains. So I recommend, if this video is interesting, that you then go read 1,000 brains. Here's the summary of the book, or at least the key piece that we'll touch on in this video. Your brain creates reference frames. It builds models inside of itself for how objects actually appear. And as you see new objects, it either fits those new objects into analogies that you already have, reference frames you've already created, or it slowly creates new reference frames so you have multiple analogies. So when you see a third object, you can determine if it fits in one analogy, another, or if it again needs to create a new model, a new reference frame for something that's altogether different. Let's listen to Jeff explain first the theory and then apply it to Palm, and then talk about how the brain continues to create analogies in management education.
In our brain, or in the neocortex, as far as we know, well, as you know, I described in the book, there's a sheet of neural tissue, all these columns. The columns look nearly identical. We speculated in our papers that every column is going to be modeling things in the world using grid cells and place cells and other types of cells that are known to exist in another part of the brain, in the entorhinal cortex and hippocampus. Since we made that speculation, there's more and more evidence that's true. People are finding this. So it is a theory, but it's being supported by more and more empirical evidence. So I'm going to go that it's true. Let's say that it's true. And so grid cells and place cells and these other types of cells I didn't write about, called vector cells, they represent space, and they do it in the way that nature evolved to do, right? So they're really weird little things, the way they work. Grid cells and vector cells and place cells are kind of strange, but they solve a problem. They solve a problem of saying, I want to represent, I want to take information about the world and put it in locations in a reference frame. And that makes it so I can act upon it. I can say, well, where is something? How do I get there? If I want to be in a certain state, what actions do I have to take? I can see analogies between two things, because literally if I have two sets of information that are structured in some reference frame, I can see where they're similar and where they're different. This is the kind of things that brains can do that most of today's AI cannot do. Most AI today doesn't have reference frames at all. But this is what brains do. What's really is important is to understand that knowledge has structure to it. It's not just a list of facts. And the structure, how it's structured in your head, how it's arranged in these reference frames, dictates how you perceive it and what you think is going to happen. 3Com thought one thing was going to happen, and the Palm founders thought something else was going to happen. We had the same data, we had the same information in front of us, but we had different experiences, and therefore we arranged that data differently.
When you meet a new object that you don't otherwise understand, and whether you viscerally or rationally say, I don't understand this, that the brain is automatically going to leap to an analogy? Or can the brain sit with saying, I don't know what this is yet, but I'll learn about it?
Well, it will. I think it's both. You're going to learn something new, but as you learn about it, the structure might be reminiscent to something you've seen before. Let me give you an example. The example I've used, I don't know if it was in the book or not, but example I've used. Imagine you've never seen a stapler, okay? You've never seen one. You don't know what it does. You do not know that it has staples, that it moves or anything like that. You just see this object. And you're looking at it and you say, okay, well, I'm going to start learning by attending the different parts of the stapler, which is what you will do. You look at the different components. And as you do, your brain is building up this model. It says, oh, it's got this at this end, it's got this at this end. It's like building a CAD model of like an engineer might build a model of a house. It's building this model inside your head of what this thing looks like. Now, you're doing this not by looking at the whole thing. You do this by attending the different components. We can bring this back to management in a moment. And as you look at different components, you're sort of figuring out where the relationships are. Oh, this has got this at this end. Now, if you look at the end of the stapler, you might see a pin and some pieces of metal next to it. And you might say, I have seen that kind of arrangement locally before. It's a hinge. I've seen something like this before on other objects, the local features, not the whole thing, but these local features, and said, well, on other objects, these kind of position of these local features is represent a hinge. So it might hinge at that point. And so even though it's a new object and you're learning a totally new object, the individual components will say, oh, these components remind me of something, another object I've known, other objects are known. Therefore, I'm going to guess that it's a hinge and that these two parts might move relative to each other. I remember when we were early on at Palm, 3Com, owned Palm, and 3Com, Eric Benamou said, oh, the handheld computing industry is just like the PC industry. Therefore, there's going to be hardware manufacturers and one dominant software manufacturer. Well, we said, no, that's not right. That's the wrong analogy. He created this reference frame that matches the PC world. And we said, no, it's not like that. The hardware and the software have to go together. And he goes, oh, no, Eric, here's the analogy. I'm sure of this. And we said, no, we're sure you're wrong. It's more like consumer products where, you have to design the whole thing together. So there's an example where sort of two business approaches where both are using analogies to previous experiences. And basically, how did we structure knowledge about the computing space of Microsoft and Intel and that kind of stuff? And versus, was it more like something like consumer electronics? And two different business people took different approaches to this, and one was wrong. Well, maybe they're both wrong, who knows? But anyway, that it wasn't correct, right? It wasn't the hands-on computing space. We don't see it structured like Microsoft as a single dominant operating system. Google tried to do that, I suppose, but really it isn't. There's just a few manufacturers. So when you're thinking about a business problem, inside your brain, there's knowledge about the world. It might be knowledge about, let's say you were working on a smartwatch and you had experience working at Palm. And so you were taking the knowledge you learned at Palm and you had some sort of, hey, I understood it to some extent. And the things you learned about Palm, it's hard to really visualize, but you can just imagine these factoids, if you will, are located, stored at locations that are encoded by these grid cells and reference frames. It's not like there's a physical structure in your head. There's these populations of neurons, then their activations represent locations and things like that. So then you go to the new problem. Oh, we're going to create a smartwatch. Maybe it's like that, and therefore you say, well, we created a developer community. Maybe we'll create a developer community. Oh, maybe we did it. This worked well in the developer community. We'll do that here. And so then you can figure what actions you have to take by analogy. And so maybe creating a developer community for the smartwatch was somehow different. But you could see analogies. So well, by analogy, we'll do X and so on. So this stuff is literally stored in your head in these neurons and these connections between neurons, and it's a distributed form like I described in the book. So when we confronted any problem, even a business problem, let's say you've got this massive, set of data you're looking at and trying to figure out what to do, or, so on. Then what you'll start doing is drilling it down, looking at the individual components. If you might be doing a financial analysis, you might start looking at the different elements in the balance sheet or whatever, I don't know. And then you might say, oh, I've seen this arrangement before. I've seen when a company's out of whack like this before, just looking at that one component. And you may say, yeah, well, maybe this is similar to my experience working, studying IBM or something like that. Or you might look at a different set of things. You might look at the supply chain and look at the details of the supply chain. You say, oh, I see this arrangement of this is the way these materials are being delivered, and the problems with that, that's similar to another company I know, right? So what we do when we confront it with something new, we start learning all the components of it. We start building this model of it, but as we do this, we'll see similarities of subsets, and then we can act upon them. Then we'll take a guess and say, well, like the stapler might have a hinge, or this company might have the same problem that IBM had in 1980 or something like that. So I think that's the general process. I don't know, it's a lot of stuff I'm just dumping on you here. That's the general process we face when we're dealing with a new problem. We just start digging in and looking at the details in different areas and trying to find similarities to other places we've seen. I can just learn a model of a problem, but I really want to know what to act on. What should I do, right? We have a management problem or a business problem. What should we do? And you're looking for these analogies.
Let's assume, and let's go back to this entrepreneurial possibility. You have 3 different analogies. How does your brain vote as to which analogy you're eventually going to go to?
Well, we're different because we have different experiences, right? So take the Palm example again. The management at 3Com had more experience perhaps thinking about, PCs. They live in the PC world. And so they had more supporting evidence for it's more like the PC Microsoft, analogy. And so they came committed to it. And we had more experience at Palm, more just because we had a history of this already, and thinking about consumer electronics, that hey, it's more like Apple. It was like Apple was doing integrated software and hardware, right? And of course, then the 3Com people saying, yeah, but Apple lost them. Apple lost, and we said, well, they didn't really lose, right? It's too early to make that determination. So here's where I want to get to your question. We are not really good with dealing with both of these scenarios. Our brains want to make a decision and go with it, right? And so we are not, as humans, we're not suited for acting on 2 possibilities for very long. In the book, I showed that classic example, or I mentioned it with the vase and the faces, that image you can see, it's a vase with 2 faces. We can't see them both at the same time. In some sense, you have to commit for a while to one or the other. And that's the way our brains work. They don't want ambiguity. They want to have a decisive conclusion. This is what it's like. We're going to go for it. And so now you can have 2 different business people who reach diametrically opposed conclusions. No one's going to be good at bridging both. It's hard to live in a world where, well, it might be like Microsoft, but it might be like consumer electronics or Apple. Let's go forward. Well, what are you going to do? You can't do both. So we sort of have to commit ourselves. And once you commit yourself, it's very hard to uncommit. So it would be better if you could spend more time thinking about the problem and trying to force yourself into another way of thinking. But I think the trick might be for me to, or him to both abandon our belief for a moment and try to adopt the other person's belief and see if I can internalize that as well. And then, and so it's like the vase in the face. You're bouncing back and forth a bit before you make a final commitment. But I think so often, well, people make the wrong decision. They commit to it and they make the wrong decision. And successful entrepreneurs somehow have a broad enough view of the world or the future, or they thought about, the future of technology, or they thought about how companies evolve to create the future of technology, or whatever the entrepreneurs, like I'm thinking tech, but it doesn't have to be, that they are able to, better than other people, see the correct analogies because they may not be the obvious ones.
Okay.
And that's why we value them. If you can, if you can do that, then you win, right? how do our old brain emotions interact with our intelligent neocortex when it comes to business decisions? And especially, some people can be very successful by just being greedy. You just like cheat, you're greedy, and you just like, you treat your customers and everyone poorly, and you just, you blast your way through. There's a lot of examples of successful people who are really motivated by poor reasons. But I don't like to think about that as much. I think if you're trying to do something really remarkable from an entrepreneurship point of view, it generally requires you check your emotions at the door. And you need to focus on that larger intellectual problem you're trying to solve, and do whatever it takes to get it solved. It's hard to have two masters. It's hard to say, you let your old brain dictate things and do what's right for the future and right for humanity and right for, the technology. Both can be successful business people. So anyway, all I'm saying is, it turns out then that when you're trying to decide what to do in business, you can be focused on the very intellectual challenge of doing something interesting and useful for the future, or you can be focused on the gut emotion, like, no, we're going to just, do whatever it takes to win. And so without putting a judgment on those two, although I could easily, without putting a judgment on, some people's old brain dominate, and some people try to check it at the door and say, no, let's try to do something more interesting. And yes, it literally really boils down to how much is your old brain taking control of your behaviors. After we started selling products, I would go to the store, which was like, I don't know what it was, Circuit City, or I don't know, what was it back who we were selling it to. And I'd hang out at the Palm area display, and I'd act like I didn't know anything about these products. And so when people came up and looked at them, I said, oh, are you into one of these new Palm things? I was curious about it. What do you know about it? What do you think you can do with this thing? What's it good for? And I would ask people that question. Of course, they didn't know who I was. And I'll try to have them explain to me what it is they thought this thing was going to do, and why they wanted it or didn't want it. And that was sort of that same thing. Get out of the office, and it was very, very useful. And also, the other thing I used to do is I used to watch people use the product. I would do like just on the street. I just see someone using one of our products on a bench or something. I would just sit there and watch them and see what happened. What they do with it. They how they put it away. I don't know. It's just like, you just learn a ton of stuff when you see this. It's amazing how much you learn just by watching and talking to people about it. Okay.
So what would you? Well, no, that's precisely in the flow. So what would you do with that information if you saw somebody at Circuit City or Best Buy? I don't even know what the modern retail equivalent is, and they explain it to you that is different than the way that the reference frame you had for what you thought. Would you change your reference frame? Does that mean
totally.
Marketing?
Totally. Totally. Everything. You change. I found it very, very. My ability to predict how customers would react to a product was poor. I found I really wasn't good at this. I could get good at it by observing people, but if I just upfront guessed, oh, here's how people are going to use this thing, I was really bad. So yes, it made a huge difference. I can give examples where, doing that, all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, I didn't realize this, this is what's important to them. How would I have known? And so very quickly you change your knowledge base and your reference frame of how someone might use the product. That can happen very quickly. I wasn't, in those cases, I had my hypothesis about like, oh, I think someone's going to use the product to do this. But if I found that they're actually doing something different, well, that very easily overtook my hypothesis because that was empirical data. It was like, oh, nope, I can see it now. Now, I didn't know that, but now I know it. So my business partner, Donna Dubinsky, once told me, she said very early on, she said, when you hire a management person, you really want someone who has experience at both a really successful company and a failing company, because you have to know what both look like. You have to be able to recognize the difference between these two. If you only have as your first experience as a really successful company, then you're going to think it's easy, and you're going to think, oh, it's always like that, right? Or if you have all your own experience with a failing company, then you won't be able to recognize the attributes of success and what it starts to look like, you know. So I think if you know, it's less about how the brain works in some sense. We have a model about the world. If your model is built only on one set of data, failing companies or successful companies, and you didn't really study or understand how companies fail, or you know, and what the success look like, if that's not part of your model, then your model is probably not very good, and you'll make mistakes based on it.
The reason that I'm doing this is to try and ensure that what we're teaching in entrepreneurship has at least some agreement with what our brains are actually doing.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah, I said earlier, there's a lot of fields that should be doing this. And we just haven't had theories of brains to do it with, right? You know, psychologists have no fundamental theory. Educators have no fundamental theory about what it means to learn something. So we make it up, you know, we see what works. So I think it's a good idea. You know, I think in the end, a business person or, you know, I think the concepts of the thousand brain theory are very valuable because they teach you what it is. They teach you that what it is to believe something and why your beliefs can be wrong. And, you know, how does the brain correct you know, I have a whole section about false beliefs and how do we correct them and make sure you're exposed to, you know, contrary evidence. It's one thing to say, oh, we're figuring how the brain understands the world and how these things work. And then, you know, how do you bring it down to practice in other fields is tricky, right? How does it impact education? How does it impact medicine? How does it impact psychiatry and psychology, right? Ultimately, all these fields should have, they should have a fundamental basis for them, right? You know, we should have a basis for understanding psychology. We should have you know, when we teach kids in school, we should know what's going on in their brains. We might be better teachers if we know that, right? And I think you're trying to bring that to business practice, which I think is pretty exciting and interesting. But, you know, we'll struggle with this. It's not going to be easy, right? It's not going to be like, oh yeah, it's obvious. No, it's not obvious at all.
Let me conclude this session with my own interpretation of what Jeff was talking about in his theory of 1,000 brains for its implication for entrepreneurship professors. What I heard from Jeff is that we should be doing two different things. First is deconstructing both past examples of entrepreneurial opportunities and companies, and then secondly, providing our students with as many analogies and examples as possible. When they arrive and experience a new entrepreneurial opportunity, their brains will jump to whatever reference frames they already have in their heads. If they only have a few analogies, they might try to jam new information into analogies that don't quite fit. Therefore, if we provide them with a catalog of analogies by function, by context, successes, and failures, we are arming them with more possible reference frames that will be more accurate given the particular context to allow them to have a model inside of their head for how this entrepreneurial opportunity might unfold successfully with lucrative impact. I look forward to joining you in not only working on these catalogs of analogies and the deconstructions, but also further deepening how the brain of our students is actually functioning so that we can further improve and tailor our mechanisms of pedagogy to create even more effective future generations of entrepreneurs. Let me give thanks to Jeff Hawkins for creating the Palm in the first place. That was my first job after business school and set the stage for me for a career in entrepreneurship, and then for conducting research and writing it in such a compelling way in the book, 1,000 Brains.